Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station. My name is Andy and we are on Yagara and Turrbal country. And today on the show, once again, I'm not in the studio. I've been a bit busy in the important work of being a father to a newborn baby, which is a very amazing experience. I will be back making regular Paradigm Shift shows soon, but for this week, we're going to delve into the archive for another classic episode, and this one back to 2016. It was this time of year. In fact, it was the 28th of October, which happened to be the 100th anniversary of a significant Australian historical event, which we will hear all about, the Conscription Referendum. There was, of course, another Conscription Referendum a year later, as you will hear. And at the time, in 2016, there'd been all this stuff about, like, the centenary of Anzac, and I was busy doing a one-person kind of centenary of resistance of war. I'd been organising a number of events, and I actually organised one the weekend that this show played back then, a collection of anecdotes from Australia's history of war resistance, which you can find on my blog, actually some of the text from it, and I'll link to it on the Paradigm Shift Facebook if you're interested. But anyway, we spoke in this show to Humphrey McQueen, and I quite enjoyed it at the time, and I still think it is an important thing to remember historically, and of course we're coming up to that anniversary again, although the 109th anniversary is not such a nice round number. But I think it's also important to remember, as we listen to this show about the successful resistance to military conscription, to remember that even though this happened quite a long time in the past, right now you have a number of countries that are involved in active wars that have military conscription, countries like Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Myanmar, as well as other countries, plenty of other countries which have conscription, even though if they're not currently actively forcing people to go to the front lines. And so hopefully some of the lessons from Australia's history can be useful to people all around the world fighting for an individual's right to refuse orders, and for the idea of all people across the world seeing each other as shared humanity, not as enemies to be fought. So you will hear this classic episode from 2016. We will, over the next hour, be talking about the Conscription Referendum in 1916. Today is the 100th anniversary of a momentous day in Australian history, actually, the day when it was put to the Australian public, should we have conscription for overseas wars, as in the one that they were involved in at that moment, World War One. At the time, they had conscription for invasion for the home front. And it was put to the public, should there be conscription for an overseas war, that being World War One? And the Australian public responded on this day in 1916 by voting no, there should not. But it was part of a very broad campaign, amazing campaign. And we're going to talk with Humphrey McQueen, legendary Labor historian, about it. I had a chat with Humphrey this morning, and it was a joy talking to him because he's somebody with a real love of history, and like myself, somebody who sees history as not something that's in the past, but something that we're a part of, that shapes us who we are and what we see for the future. And so we're going to be talking all about that. By the end of this show, you'll be much more informed about what happened on this day 100 years ago. Certainly sheds a very new light on the popular history of what Australia was like in World War One, which we have over the last year or so been inundated with, and the federal government put $300 million into commemorating the centenary of Anzac. As Humphrey McQueen says, we haven't noticed very much from the federal government commemorating these referendums. But fortunately, across Australia, there are people today and this weekend who are remembering this anniversary and what it means for Australia. You're on The Paradigm Shift. This is Humphrey McQueen talking about the conscription referendum.
It's Humphrey McQueen in Canberra talking about one of the great days in European Australian history. Today, the 100th anniversary of the defeat of the attempt to impose conscription for overseas military service.
So, Humphrey, you have written a lot about history and radical history. Why do you consider that this referendum is such an important event?
Well, what's important about it is that it was an occasion on which we can see what the vast majority of the people wanted to say and do when they got the chance to be able to. That because it wasn't compulsory voting, but the turnout was very large. So that it's not just a matter of, people campaigned, there were street marches or something. When it came to the point on two occasions, because there's another one comes up in December 1917, and the majority against was even bigger on that occasion, we've got documentary proof that people voted no, that they were against it. And that, in a way, is much more important than the vote for federation. I mean, with federation, except in South Australia, only the males were allowed to vote, and the turnout for federation was much smaller. So if you're thinking in terms of European Australian history, the votes against the two conscription votes in 1617, and I might say here as well, because I think they're connected, the vote against banning the Communist Party in 1951, all of these three things come together and say, what kind of country would it have been if governments had been given those extra powers? What would it have meant in terms of the balance of class forces in Australia if the government could have done all of those things with the legal sanction of a majority vote? The fact that it didn't go that way, that it went the opposite way, meant that the government they still wanted to do things, they still wanted to do fairly oppressive and repressive things, but they knew, they'd been taught that they had to be more circumspect about it. And the workers, on their hand, got a great boost into the confidence that they could bring to the class struggle. So that on both sides, and this sense of consciousness of how you feel about going into battle is an important element, as well as the legal question. So from my point of view, when we have a socialist Australia, we can abolish the Queen's birthday, Anzac Day and Christmas, and put in, as public holidays, the defeat of the two conscription votes and the defeat of the anti-communist bill. So that's some idea of how important I think these three occasions were for the shaping of contemporary Australian political life.
Are the two referendums in World War One the only time in history any country's been able to vote on whether there'd be conscription or not?
As far as I know. You've got to remember that Switzerland is a very peculiar case. They've had a kind of conscription for hundreds of years, and they didn't. Women didn't get the vote there until very recently, but they've also had a system of almost every kind of issue that the Parliament or the government votes on would have been put to the general population. So it's quite possible, without being able to be sure, that not only did the Swiss have conscription, universal conscription, but it would have been one of the things that they would have got to vote on. Of course, they haven't actually got to war as Switzerland for a very long time, but they sold themselves as mercenaries to the highest bidder, including the Pope.
So the referendum, as I understand it, came because Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, went to Europe. He was very pro-war and wanted to send more Australian troops, but the Labor Party, his own party, was against it, and so he couldn't get it through Parliament. Is that right?
That's pretty much right. I mean, there are two questions there. One is, why did he want to deal with the fall-off in the numbers of people who were volunteering? And it is important to remember that in this war, you asked about, were we the only place where you voted? Australia was the only country fighting where all of the troops were volunteers all the way through the war. Every other country in the war had conscription. We were the only ones that, for one reason or another, didn't go down that route. Now, in very narrow terms, when Hughes got back from England and he wanted to get conscription for overseas service, and again, if I divert here for a moment, there'd been conscription for home defence from about 1910. So that people were being conscripted even when the vote was going on, but they couldn't be sent overseas. So the question was, could you get support to send them, make them go overseas? Now, here, Hughes could have got it through the lower house because the non-Labor parties were all in favour of it. However, the majority, and this is again going into quite complex political matters, but in 1914 there'd been a double dissolution of the Parliament, so all, in those days, only 36 members in the Australian upper house for the Senate. There were 36 of them. Most of them, overwhelmingly, about 30 of them, I think, were members of the Labor Party, because you had a first-past-the-post system. There was no preferential voting. So the Labor Party got all the seats. Now, overwhelmingly, the people in the Senate were against conscription for overseas service. So Billy couldn't get it through the upper house. And that is technically why he felt he had to go around it. But the other thing to remember is that within the Labor movement, not just the Labor Party, the support for conscription for home defence was very widespread. That it was considered to be more democratic than having an elite regular army that was used to suppress the working class struggles. So that, you know, that a conscript army, as in Switzerland, and that was often cited as an example, but the Labor movement here was all in favour of that. And they were also campaigned right from the beginning for initiative, referendum and recall. These were democratic ways. These were ways of controlling. When you sent representatives into the Parliament, the buggers could go off and do whatever they liked. Well, if you could have initiative to put proposals for legislation up to the Parliament, if you could have a referendum on it, and if the people didn't vote the way you liked, you could get a petition together and get them sort of taken out of Parliament. These were considered to be prime Labor Party policies, and the Labor movement was very supportive of them. So you get this sort of complicated situation where the Labor movement is in favour of conscription at home. Most of them are against conscription going overseas, and that gets more complicated, which we might say something about at the moment. And thirdly, you get this thing that having a popular vote was something that they should do all the time. So Hughes was able to draw on both of those to say, well, what we'll do is we will put it to the people. Now, much to his surprise, and I have to say it is quite extraordinary, you're in the middle of a war in which the propaganda, partly because the censorship was so total, and the lies that were being told about, the Germans, terrible atrocities that they were being accused of, in the midst of this, nonetheless, 52% of the population voted no, and then 54 about 15 months afterwards. Now, that in itself, given that all the major newspapers, because that was the only public form of information in those days. All of that was going against the people who wanted to say, no, we shouldn't, and yet they still managed to get 52%. So that was terribly important to him. The second time, because they then had a federal election in May 1917, which the vote went the other way. The Labor Party was sort of largely defeated, and Billy Hughes thought again, well, the vote swung around, so they would have another go. And this time, however, it was even, as I said, from 52% against to 54% against. But having had the vote the first time, he wasn't game to use the majority that he had in the Senate to get it through. I mean, technically, he could have done it after May 1917. But politically, the opposition would have been so great. And you could imagine the opposition that would have come in practical terms had they done it, put the piece of legislation through, and then gone round to make people who didn't want to go, drag them out of their homes. You imagine the kind of brawls and uprisings and strikes and, all the civil unrest that would have come out of that. So they had to go again. They didn't want to, but politically they knew they couldn't get away with it. And that, I think, is part of, as I was saying at the very start, why it's so important, because the no vote determined the class consciousness, the kind of fear on the part of the Tories and the confidence on the part of the workers that they could stand up to them.
You mentioned in there a bit the newspapers were very pro-conscription. They even printed how to vote cards in the newspapers, but also censorship. And this is one of the interesting things, is the War Precautions Act made virtually any anti-war material illegal, and a number of people were put in jail for just speaking out against the war. Is that right?
That's certainly right. And the War Precautions Act, which, continued well after the war. It's a very strange thing to say. The Solicitor General, who was very much, in charge of organising it, in his autobiography, if I just read you this bit, he said, the regulations were mostly expressed widely to make sure that we'd covered everything. The result soon was that John Citizen was hardly able to lift a finger without coming under the penumbra of some technical offence. So it wasn't only saying anything. They put the law in such a way that almost whatever you thought or you did or anything, they could get you under something or other. And the fact that the vote went no meant that they again weren't game to enforce that quite as ferociously as they might otherwise have done, for fear of the resistance that would be provoked. So, yes, it was certainly there. As you well know, they eventually raided the Queensland Parliament to take the Hansard because they'd banned certain pamphlets coming out. The Labor government there, the most radical government that Australia's ever had in those years, they then read it into Hansard and were printing it as Hansard. And this federal police force turned up to seize copies of Hansard. That's how far it had gone to suppress any real spread of ideas. And yet the no vote won.
That's one very famous example, the Hansard story in Queensland. Other ones, Tom Barker, of course, went to jail for printing a famous anti-war poster, but also future Prime Minister John Curtin went to jail. Is that right?
I think that's probably right. The Builders Labourers Federation in Victoria, they had their whole publication, it was suppressed after their opposition to the proposal to introduce conscription for overseas service. So it wasn't just the particular articles would appear. Because as you know, what was supposed to happen was when an article was they said, no, you can't publish that, you were supposed to put something in its place. Well, some of the Labor papers decided what they'd do would be to leave blank spaces to show where the censorship was. And that then became an offence, that you couldn't even leave out the thing that was supposed to go in. But in the case of the Builders Labourers, it wasn't the only one, their union journal was completely banned because of their big campaign against conscription for overseas service. So it went in every conceivable direction.
So the union movement was very strong against conscription and was one of the reasons what people give for the no vote. But also people talk about the influence of Irish republicanism and of the Catholic Church, and particularly the Melbourne Archbishop Daniel Mannix. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a bit more of a kind of vexed issue as to whether or not the Irishness and indeed Archbishop Mannix's own way of dealing with it might have driven more people over to vote yes. For fear, because we've got to remember, that this was a time in which people were the Protestants were as much frightened of the Pope as they were of the Kaiser. The anti-Catholic feeling was very, very strong. And the sense of the Irish and the Sinn Féin and, the use of violence in Ireland during 1916, all of this, you can't be entirely sure, because it's important to remember that Victoria, where the Labor movement itself was very strong, was one of the few states that voted yes. So that this notion that while Mannix was out there campaigning, that he then swung people over, it may be that he actually so antagonised people that, people who might have sort of come across to voting against conscription were so fearful of this ferocious representative of this, the Scarlet Woman, the sort of evil of the papacy that was going to, take everything over. But it's difficult for us now to recall how powerful those feelings were. And the other thing to remember is, of course, that almost all the other hierarchy in the Catholic Church here were in favour that they were not going to that they were not going to speak out in the way that he did. So he was pretty exceptional in that regard. Now, there's no doubt that amongst rank and file Irish, particularly not because of the rebellion in Ireland itself, but because after the rebellion, they took the leaders of the rebellion out and shot them. And that was really what antagonised and outraged people. So, like all of these things, it's a more nuanced story than simply saying, well, Archbishop Mannix came out and swung people over to the anti-side. I think most of the people who voted under his kind of encouragement would have voted no anyway.
One other thing that's interesting is the role of women. A lot of the propaganda from both sides was aimed at women, and it seems very interesting that in a lot of the world, including the United Kingdom, women didn't have the right to vote in elections, and in Australia they were voting as to whether to have forced conscription. What was the role of women in the campaign?
Well, as you say, it was very big on both sides. In the anti-side, a number of the leading antis were being picked up in the street and arrested because, we're talking about banning publications. They also banned street meetings. So that if you got up on a soapbox and began to speak, the police would come along and carry you off. And one of the leaders of this, the anti-movement, was a woman in Victoria, Vida Goldstein. And she kept on getting arrested, and other women did too. And it was, as it was for the suffragettes, it became embarrassing for the government to have to put these women into jail because they were respectable middle-class women, and it wasn't the kind of look that they wanted to give to their campaign. Now, on the other side, and this is very important to remember, a lot of the kind of pro-conscription side came from the from those women whose sons and husbands had already volunteered and thought that they should be supported. So it was quite well divided. We have no real idea, of course, as to whether more women voted yes. There were no opinion polls in those days. It has to be very, very sort of impressionistic of the stories that you can pick up around it. The one story that we know and that people repeat endlessly is the handing out of the white feather. That someone who hadn't volunteered, they would be handed, or they would receive in the mail, this sign that they were a coward. Now, that bit of the story has been spread very widely. But there's the other side to it, and that is that there are some examples, and there are probably a lot more that we just haven't had sort of given the publicity to, of where the workers turned on those employers who hadn't volunteered. There's a case in Hobart of a builder's labourer chasing one of the master builders down Argyle Street, shouting out after him that he should go to the front and get shot along with his two sons. So that the sense of the handing out of the white feather being handed out by sort of, upper-class ladies to the working-class blokes, that was true, but there was also on the other side, there were the workers who were saying, as you mentioned Tom Barker before, the whole notion of this thing that there was this would to God brigade. And they would, and the joke was that these people who hadn't volunteered would say, "Oh, would to God I were not so rich, and then I could go to the front." So the humour and the political attack was directed against both sides in this. And as you say, women had the vote, which pretty much they had here from around 1903. It's a bit more complicated than that, but this was something that, by and large, very, very few other places in the rest of the world had. And as I said, it was part of that democratic temper of initiative, referendum and recall. And remember also that conscription for home defence was considered to be a democratic activity to break the power of the regular army that was used to go into battle against the strikers. There's one other thing that is worth throwing in here to remember, something else that happened before the end of 1917, and that's the Bolshevik Revolution. Would it have happened had there not been a conscript army? Because what happened was that the Tsar, in order to win the war from his side, not only conscripted most of the population, but he had to arm them. And when they lost, and the whole Eastern Front was just falling apart, what it meant was you now had the peasants and the workers. Not only were they against the Tsar, but the Tsar had lost the monopoly of violence. So that in one sense, you could say that conscription for overseas service was a necessary condition for the Bolshevik Revolution.
I want to go back a bit. You mentioned the white feather story, and it's interesting, this thing, because the First World War is so mythologized in Australia's image of itself, and there's all these films and books and this whole industry of Anzac-ery, as it's been called. And the conscription referendum, and remembering that, challenges it in a few ways. One is that obviously the public wasn't as pro-war as it might seem now, but the other thing is that Billy Hughes would repeatedly say that Australia wasn't pulling its weight in the war and needed to send more soldiers, and this idea of Australia being the heroes, if that was true, then the referendum never would have been needed.
Well, yes, there certainly is that side to it. And it's important to remember, as you've just been really beginning to suggest there, that, as I said right at the beginning, on two occasions, substantial majorities of the population expressed their point of view. Where are the millions of dollars being spent to commemorate that? Of course they're not. And why not? Because the boss class don't want us to remember that we beat them. So of course that's not the story they're telling. Of the 150 million that they spent on Anzac-ery, they're not putting any money into this. There was one postage stamp that had both a yes and a no on it. And that's as far as any official recognition has so far gone. And one should not be surprised. Of course, they're not going to promote the fact that they got kicked in the guts, because it might encourage us to do it again. so that the whole mythology around the war had to be really, and a lot of it is a very recent reconstruction in the last, really the last 25 years, that most of the effort has been able to go into it, and more and more money has been put into it. But as you say, if you look at the fact that people weren't volunteering as much as they had done, you do then have to ask yourself, well, were we, as the kind of, one version of the mythology is, were we as pro-war as we were? And it's important to remember, though, that the fact that you voted against conscription doesn't mean to say you were against the war. These were not one and the same. See, where you had a volunteer system and there were 3 sons, the family would get together and say who would volunteer to go, and one of the boys would stay at home to look after the parents. So some of the people who were in favour of the war, who'd sent 2 sons to war, voted no because of this family arrangement that was going to be totally upturned. So there's all kinds of complications as to why people were for the war but against conscription for overseas service.
So one last question, Humphrey. I guess the World War I is often talked about as the war that shaped Australia as a nation, and I think you've mentioned one interesting thing, which is a really important period before the war in Australia's federation as well was important. But what do you think is the real influence of World War I on Australia as a country?
Well, if I could take a side view of that first. One of them was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, also in 1916, 100 years ago, to divide up the Ottoman Empire. And we're still fighting that war. That's what's going on in Syria and Iraq and everywhere today. Those lines that the British and French colonialists drew on the map to get their hands on the oil and other wealth, that has shaped us all the way through. And of course it's come back particularly in the last 20 years or so to haunt us in a very, very powerful way. However, as I said right at the beginning, I think the thing that the conscription votes really showed was that the power of the capitalists was constrained, that they weren't able to enforce their anti-union activities, all of the other things they would have loved to have done. But the workers had that confidence that they were able to organise and to fight back. And now, they weren't able to do what happened so much when the conscripts turned their weapons on the Tsarist regime. We didn't get socialism in Australia, but it has meant that even though we've been deprived publicly of the real recognition of it because of the the censorship that went on ever since about what was really important and how these things had happened, that I think in practical terms has really stayed on there, so that by the time we get to Vietnam in 1966, there is still this real sense that the Australian people will remember what happened 50 years before and vote against sending troops to Vietnam in 1966. Now, unfortunately, the elections at the end of 1966 did not go that way at all, and it took several more years, and really the great courage and victories of the Vietnamese and Indonesian and Indo-Chinese driving the imperialists into the sea, that ended the war there, rather than any particular vote that we had here, although the campaign did build again after the Tet Offensive in 1968.
All right, thanks very much, Humphrey.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
We have been talking about the conscription referendum in 1916 with Humphrey McQueen. He had a lot to say, Humphrey, a great interview and a great passion for it and a knowledge of that history. And I think there's a lot of interesting things. I think one of the real things that I think we need to take it and talk about this is what Humphrey talked about right at the start, about that Australia there'd been this real movement for democracy within Australia from federation, and people talk about it, the term social laboratory is often used of Australia as a new nation, how it constituted itself, and we're the first country to legislate a 40-hour week, one of the first countries to give women the vote, and a lot of welfare system and all these kind of things, and that this was a real proud thing about Australia. And somehow in the kind of transition of how we talk about the Australian history, we talk about First World War, and the values that made Australia great, of sacrifice and of mateship and looking after your mates, whatever, as if every other country that fought in that war didn't sacrifice and didn't look after their mates in the trenches. Like, there's nothing distinctive about that Australian history. The real proud Australian history is lost, and in a lot of ways people talk about the war as the thing that ended that in some ways, and I think Henry pointing out that democracy and the fact that Australia did vote for conscription, that should be a proud part of Australian history, you know. And this is, of course, the other thing that we should remember about this history as we come to a close, that this idea of foreign wars, and it's not some remote thing, that Australia is currently fighting foreign wars, has for the last 15 years been in wars overseas, and a lot of these things are still the same. And when it talks about what it takes to challenge war, to challenge these, then we're still talking about the same things. How do we organise people? How do we challenge government suppression of radical ideas? How do we get together and make our ideas relatable and to everyday life? So connecting union movements to overseas wars, and talk about, you know, these things. All these questions are still alive, and I guess this is part of the idea of talking about this history now, is that we still need to work out these same things today.
I'm Triple Z. You have been listening to The Paradigm Shift, a classic episode from all the way back in October 2016, speaking with Humphrey McQueen about the conscription referendum. And I hope you enjoyed this little trip into the past, both the recent past when I first recorded that episode, and the more distant past when ordinary people in Australia fought for democracy, really, in their own country, the right to vote on whether people should be forced to go to war or not. And it is a worthwhile piece of history to remember, and something worth fighting for as we go forwards as well. Of course, since the Iraq War, there has been a campaign for the war powers to be changed so that the government has to vote for Australia to go to war. Of course, at the moment, the Australian government doesn't even really choose the American commander-in-chief of the military. The president sends that country to war, and Australia goes where we are told to go. And so there's much left to do, much struggle left for us here in the 21st century to make Australia the kind of peaceful and independent nation we would like it to be. But let's keep the struggle up, and I'll see you next week on The Paradigm Shift again.